A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. Created by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome to A Brush With, the podcast from the art newspaper in which I talk to artists about their influences, from writers to musicians, filmmakers and of course other artists, and the cultural experiences that have shaped their lives and work. And in this episode it's a brush with Kapwani Kiwanga, who works primarily in sculpture and installation, but also with performance, sound and video. She explores what she's called power asymmetries, drawing from forgotten or unexpected histories, and studies in everything from botany to sociology to create enigmatic but alluring objects and environments in a wealth of materials. Research is at the heart of her project, but it triggers unique combinations of ideas where forms that might initially appear entirely aesthetic and informed by modernist geometries are in fact documents and witnesses to complex socio-political ideas and events. Materials are rarely selected simply for their visual effect. Instead, Kapwani chooses them for their historic, economic or cultural uses. A remarkable economy and precision underpins her language, through which she maximises an acute experiential balance between pleasure, curiosity and disquiet. Kapwani was born in Hamilton in Canada in 1978 and has lived in Paris since 2005. She initially studied anthropology and comparative religion at McGill University in Montreal before moving to Europe, where she pursued an interest in experimental film. For a brief period she made documentary films before studying at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and then at Le Fresnoy, the School for Audio Visual and Digital Art in Tourcoing in France. It was while there that she created what she regards as her first artwork, the Sanra Repatriation Project from 2009, a speculative documentary that picked up on the great jazz musician's claim that he was from the planet Saturn and attempted to repatriate him to the gas giant by means of an interplanetary communication system. Her interest in Afrofuturism and speculative fictions continued in her three-part lecture performances Afro Galactica, which tapped into the real history of Pan-Africanist hopes for a United States of Africa and imagined its space program. The independence movements that underscored Pan-Africanism are at the heart of one of Kapwani's most notable ongoing works, Flowers for Africa, begun in 2013. For these sculptures and installations, she found photographs of key moments in the independence of African nations and remade the garlands, floral arrangements and bouquets in them using fresh flowers. These are allowed to decay across the course of the exhibition, a metaphor for the fate of many of the utopian ideals underlying the cause of African activism and liberation. Flowers and plants loom large in Kapwani's work. She's made a series of pieces using sisal, in which the fibrous natural material that's often used in ropes and cords is allied to geometric metal structures. Sisal's potency for Kapwani lies in its importance to the country Tanzania and its relationship to colonial powers. It's a material emblem for the movement between the global north and the global south. Elsewhere, in the Marias from 2020, she looks at the history of the peacock flower, which was used by enslaved indigenous women in Suriname as an aid to abortion, so that their children would not also be enslaved. Amid walls and on plinths painted bright yellow, Kapwani showed paper versions of the peacock bushes, alluding to the hobbies of Victorian women, often in colonial environments. Meanwhile, the seeds formed into clusters and presented in the form of a modernist grid in Semence from 2020 allude to the practice of enslaved African women in the Americas who would use rice grains brought from Africa to grow crops to survive on the plantations and beyond them if they were able to escape. But as much as nature and its inevitable connection to climate catastrophe is at the heart of Kapwani's work, so too is architecture and the power relations inherent in it. In Pink Blue from 2017, she looked at how colours have been used to pacify prisoners and to prevent drug abuse in urban environments. In her linear paintings from the same year, as we'll hear, she creates apparently abstract paintings that refer to theories relating to the painting of hospital walls to avoid infectious diseases. She's also created numerous installations that involve hanging architectural screens. Terrarium, made for the Venice Biennale in 2022, featured semi-transparent paintings on fabric, including one that was 20 metres long, which captured the intoxicating colours of desert sunsets, alongside hourglass sculptures filled with sand, a reference to desert fracking. The hourglass sculptures again evoke modernist artworks, but also alluded to the Wardian cases created by the 19th century botanist Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, which were used to transport and, importantly, extract plants as part of the colonial project. Cloak from 2022, meanwhile, features a curtain of beads coated in aluminium taken from floodlights that are used in urban surveillance, which had been melted down and pulverised. The curtain is a metaphor for veiling, for being observed while unprotected. And beads, this time those from Morano, the glassmaking island in Venice, feature again in Kapwani's presentation in the Canada Pavilion at the 2024 Venice Biennale. We spoke as she was putting the finishing touches to her Biennale project, so I began our conversation on this subject. Most presentations in Venice pavilions either take nationhood or location, whether that's the pavilion itself or the environment of Venice, as a starting point. So I asked Kapwani, which is it for her?
I think I probably dealt with site being the architectural site of the Venice Biennale. But no, really, in general, in my practice, I respond to place.
Yeah.
And that place can be architectural, it can be social, historic. So I really want to always know, where am I standing? What came before? What's kind of specific about this spot? And so that's kind of was the guiding principle. And when we first did our first site visit, there was kind of two directions I could have taken, and both of those based on site. One of them was much more botanic and was really interested in the giardini, but I ended up kind of having to make another choice, and I went into another direction. But so, yeah, site, meaning the site of Venice, but also of the pavilion itself, of course, then shaped the literal shapes and the forms that I ended up making.
Right. So it's called Trinket, and you're focusing on these conteria, these little beads that were a form of currency historically.
Correct. Yeah. Either currency or simple, trade material. So sometimes they were really independently could be used as money or just in a barter kind of exchange system. So yeah, the conteria is the starting point.
Right. And are you actually having them made in Morano, or are they based on existing designs from Morano?
So in fact, a portion of them are, I guess you could say, vintage Morano beads. So these seed beads or conteria are not being made anymore. But I was able to find a family-owned business that had a big stock of beads that had been some dating from the 30s, etc. So they're Morano beads. They're made there. That's
amazing. And so it seems to me that this piece relates very closely to a piece that you made called Cloak in 2022, which was at the new museum, where again you made beads, but they were a very different kind of bead made from metal. But they're loaded materials, aren't they, in that sense? But they form these kind of curtains or cloaks.
It's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, because for me, the beads were not like the main, I guess, common denominator. But in fact, you're right. The material is always the common denominator. The material as a vector of history and a kind of I always see materials as documents in themselves, right? Ways in which we can kind of delve into history, into thought, philosophical theory through a different kind of entry point. And so there is also this, I guess, question of transformation or mutation, which is in all materials. In the show at the New Museum Cloak, there was this transformation from floodlight hoods to a metal wire that ended up becoming a kind of a paint. And in this case, of course, thinking about sand, then turning that into glass and different colors and all the chemistry that is almost alchemic in some ways of making these glass beads. So yeah, there is this, I think, this common denominator of material more so than I would say the repetition of beads per se.
I really love this idea of materials as documents. You've also referred to materials as witnesses. And these are sort of archival terms. And it speaks to this idea of you seeing the archive as a kind of movable feast, a kind of creative space to a certain degree.
Correct. Yeah, I think my starting point is often archive, also articles and thoughts of experts in different fields. But there's this frustration at kind of the limits of that, the archive. And of course, an archive, like anything, is curated, and there's things that are left out, and it appeals to a part of one's intelligence. And I think trying to find new documents or new documentation, materials that can open up different ways of being in the world, but also thinking. And so that, will elicit more of our body and maybe a more incorporated question of knowledge, or not even knowledge, but experience, let's say.
And I love this idea also that you said that you're not in the business of academic citation. You're not interested in that kind of archive, if you like. But the research is similar. You're reading very deeply about your subjects, but it just takes a different material form to a certain degree.
Correct. I'm super, I guess, respectful of those who can be so rigorous and go in and do all the citations, etc. But it's really not the point. It's really to myself just be as rigorous as I can in my questioning. And I get so excited about going to the end of a question and just researching as best as I can. And then from there, seeing, well, how can I myself contribute something different? And academics can do that. They can do the writing and they do that very well. And I think maybe I wouldn't do that so well. So I found another way to explore. And also, as I said, to try to really work with these different intelligences that are not just the cerebral.
Right. And that seems to me to be absolutely crucial in terms of how the audience receives the information, if you like, because of course you allow the audience to decide how much they absorb and so on. But there is this element, I guess, that art can do that academic text can't, which is a kind of form of seduction. And I really feel that when I'm seeing your work, there's a kind of visual appeal that draws us in. And it's then that all sorts of other sort of much more complex and subtle things start happening in terms of our experience of the work and what we interpret from it.
Yeah, there is this desire, I think, to really embrace. I guess you'd interpret seduction in whatever way you'd like. And it's, for me, I think what I would want to maybe, clarify for me, it's not so much about manipulation or all the rest. It's really kind of more of a welcoming. It's more like, how can I create an open and welcoming space in which we can sit with difficult questions, we can look at complexity and not just do this superficial flyover of things, or be in a situation of reaction in which we are opposing a situation. So I think it's really creating a space to think and to allow to absorb ideas and then to do what one wants with that, right?
Yeah.
But at least to be in a situation which one can be receptive.
Yeah. And do you have to work really hard at that kind of economy of language that you achieve? Because I'm thinking about something like The Marias, which is a work from 2020, in which you have this yellow space and these paper flowers. And those paper flowers evoke all sorts of material, both a sort of visual reference to Victorian women fashioning paper flowers, but then also the history of the peacock flower in relation to enslaved people. It seems to me that economy must be quite hard won, even though it looks almost effortless when you actually come up against it.
When it works, it works. And it's that moment when it does. I mean, there's these layers and layers and layers. And I think that's why I spend so much time with research. I spend, the lifespan of a work, I'd say, I start 70% as a research and 30% is actually making a form that can then be shared with other people. And it's all that time of just reading and letting things settle and kind of superimpose. And then eventually you're like, oh, that overlaps. Oh, I can then make that. And all the materials, of course, are really specific choices. And so, as you mentioned, the paper flowers, I could have done other kind of renderings of the peacock flower, but it made so much sense when I started to do more and more research around what was kind of contemporary to what I was reading in terms of what was happening in Suriname and abortitives for women in the condition of slavery. I was also looking at what's happening, on the other side in Britain. And so there are these kind of just congruencies and overlaps that are always there, I think. It's just a question of also allowing them to meld. And formally, it is I guess just experience. There's somehow at one moment it clicks and we try out many things and eventually it feels like, oh, it's at home. All of these different facets can be distilled into something that's quite simple, but that is, really charged with layers of history and also geographies.
Yeah, absolutely. And within those histories and geographies, of course, there's something which you've referred to as power asymmetries. And essentially, that's the core of the work, isn't it? It's about forms of power and how they are asymmetrical. Yeah,
I'm really interested in just asking the question, why? Huh? I mean, it's really simple. It's a really simple starting point. So why are things as they are now? And observing these asymmetries. And if one does a little bit of research, one will find the law, one will find, the social convention, which one takes for granted because we're so used to it. And then one sees the kind of the really basic building blocks that structure these structural asymmetries. And so I think, I wouldn't say unearthing, but bringing those to light and then refashioning them to think about them allows us to also just think about, again, where we're standing, like we started at the beginning of our conversation, where we are, how we're placed, and how things were built around us. So it's kind of these social architectures or, societal architectures.
And in terms of your Venice project and so much more, it seems to me that there's a really interesting relationship with time in your work. Time is very elastic. The example of the Marias, again, you're able to employ languages from different eras and so on, but also you're able to refer to different historical moments, and that might be a moment of urgent currency in relation to, for instance, surveillance in the US or something, but also to the sort of surveillance of enslaved people and the so-called lantern law. So the way you can bring those together, it seems to me, is really interesting. And that's, I guess, to do with that research that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's really what we have now. I mean, very few things just spring out of nowhere. There are often roots that if one is patient enough to dig and go into this alternative of many things, one sees, oh, this has precedence. And there's also just these recurring themes that we kind of do as humans, and they take on different forms. But in fact, there's often, if one looks, one can see, oh, there is a root to this. There is something that preceded this, that trained one to then produce what we have now. There's no question of origin, I think, because things then end up looping back, because in that quest of kind of like trying to figure out why is it like this now, one comes across these other kind of brushes or these breaks in the structure where people did things differently and kind of circumnavigated. And those are often moments and layers that I try to also incorporate into my work, is showing how structurally, or maybe these questions of power asymmetries, etc. But then there was also these moments of libertarian and, I guess, resistance, or just, pure creativity within that. And so, yeah, there's that question of time overlapping, but in those past, there was also the future in terms of, imagining a different way of being and relating to one another. If one looks at a lot of our laws, and we could say how society is structured now, 50 years back, they were, again, these future aspirations of sorts. So I kind of see these kind of like hopeful seeds of a future that are often buried in the past, as one would in, like these dormant seeds that one finds, underground. So yeah, there's always this question of folding of time. And I think it's continually living with this capiousness of past, present, future, and, these anterior futures as well.
You've used this term exit strategies. Tell me more about that term. Do you mean in terms of the content of the work or the entire experience of the work?
It's really the experience. I think as all the work, I'm trying to somehow have a physical, a complete experience, one which is, for some people it might be more intellectual, others it might be more of an experience of moving through space and what it is like having the body to move through an environment that is slightly different from how we move through the world anyways, because that, again, we're talking about the structures and how our bodies are formed also by the structures around us. Why do we sit in a certain way? Why do we keep certain distances or not based on our culture? And so creating these moments in which we can be in a space or be with one another or be in relation to scale or color or even, it could be smell or warmth in a different way is a slight moment of just being slightly different. So being in a different way. And so at once one becomes conscious maybe of themselves in space and can then perhaps react or be differently.
Absolutely. And I think one of the ways in which one feels that when one's experiencing your work physically is in the sort of porousness of it. It's in the way that, for instance, you might use fabric, which is see-through or whatever, but even in the grains of sand, for instance, there's a sense in which everything has air in it, if you know what I mean.
Well, there's this real, I think flux is one of the words that comes to mind, and things are always moving. And of course, sometimes we can't see the movement. And there's some past work I've done around geological time and also these questions of tectonic shifts. And, the continents are moving at like centimeters per year. That doesn't seem like a lot, but if one had the vision to kind of feel and sense these like millimeters of movement over time. So there is always this question of movement. And I think the static is something that I'm constantly have difficulty with. And so there's always this question of becoming, reimagining, rebeing, remaking, because there is also that potentiality and that it's generative in the pace of not being stuck in something. So materials that allow for that feeling also, that the body can then feel. And also I think that allows you to liberate one's thinking in some ways. So those are part of the exit strategies too, to be able to be fluid, to be able to meld into one another and to be conscious, I guess, of, there's boundaries that do exist, but we've created ones which don't necessarily need to. So, the beginnings and ends of my skin or of an individual and a community or an individual and an environment or something that, of course, if one changes cultural systems, if one changes, geographies, those also shift. So I think I'm always trying to be as open as possible to allow for that movement and that flux.
Would you say then that there is an element of metaphor in your materials? Do you welcome metaphor? Is it an imposter? To what extent do you engage with metaphor, I guess?
No, I don't think so. Not so much. I think from time to time it might sneak in. But I think it's much more experiential. I try really that it really comes through something that language doesn't have to be part of it. It can in some situations, but it really is experience, I would say.
Let's move on to the questions that we ask all our guests. Who was the first artist whose work you loved?
I'm going to be very bad at this. I don't have an answer. I was racking my brain. I don't have an answer.
But I suppose that's an interesting answer, just from the point of view that you didn't study art at graduate level. So you came to art late to a certain degree.
Exactly.
It's almost you came to art through other disciplines. So you weren't fangirling over certain artists like I was in my teenage years.
It is very much that's the case, is that I think I so much more imbued in social sciences and just being in the world, which is everyday lived quotidian. And that's still the which influences me the most. So I don't have like an extremely strong admiration for art history. I think it's something that I've little by little kind of come to understand a bit more and to find, I guess, my family or my peoples within that. But it's very spotty, and I really prefer to always think about just the everyday. I think also just so that it can be also maybe a bit more open, again, that question of fluidity and openness.
And the next question is which historical artist you turn to the most today. I'm particularly interested in how your work relates to modernism and the history of modernism, because it's an inevitable association to anyone who is at all aware of geometric modernism, of Mondrian, for instance. To what extent is that a deliberate engagement or a deliberate flirtation, if you like?
I think there's something that maybe one cannot extract kind of the sum of their experiences. So I think probably growing up where I've grown up, there has been just a hierarchy of forms that one encounters. And that maybe is one that I encountered quite a bit. But I think there's also something just about my person that likes things to be distilled and ordered in some ways. And so there is this question of making something elegant and spending enough time with it that one can, I guess, distill is the word. So I understand why that question comes up, and it comes up often. But I don't come from the same starting point, I would say. Formally, that makes sense to me, and I've decided to embrace it and not to shy away from it. But I think I've also, if there's anything deliberate in it, it's deliberately saying, I can use this language, I can have my space in it, and it will be my language without having to necessarily be referential. And others can put me in the lineage if they'd like to, can make comparisons. But as I don't like citation, I myself am not going to, look at a judge or something and say, yes, I'm going to respond to this, and to be in dialogue or to be in debate. Yeah. That's really not the intention. It's just something that really comes intuitively and naturally and feels, as with the Marias, it's different. It's not as minimal in its form. But there's a distillation that happens. And it's like, okay, this is it. This is the form, and this is what it should be. Right.
I imagine, therefore, that the Canada Pavilion at the Venice Biennale is a really productive space for you to engage with, because it has a kind of beautiful high modernist quality to it. And therefore, it's a space to subvert or play with in all sorts of ways, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's a challenging space because it is so strong. I mean, like many pavilions, it has a strong character, but it's so beautifully made. And I couldn't help but kind of follow some of the lines, kind of dance with it, but then also push against it in other ways. So it's a composition, I think, of at once deep respect for just that space that's created, and at the same time trying to kind of mix a bit more organic or fluid forms. So we have these like really rectilinear lines that are part of the pavilion that do continue in my proposition for the Canada Pavilion. Yet at the same time, they do butt up against, more globalist kind of forms. And I think that is found in my work too, kind of the straight line and the more kind of rounded forms are often in this kind of cohabitation.
I wanted to talk in this context about Semence, which is a work which was shown in London a couple of years back. And it's a grid. It's a modernist grid, if you like. But interestingly, when you go up close, you see that each of the what look like dots on the grid are clusters of ceramic rice grains. And that seems to me to be a really productive example of how you engage with perhaps a modernist language, but subvert it or work completely in a different sphere that just happens to have a correlation with it.
Exactly. I think it's a great example because where the inspiration came from, apart from creating a kind of a plinth, which is, painted in a whitish color, were really the dimensions that come from, I think it was an agronomical document that the most common way of planting rice seeds is 7 grains together and this distance apart. So I basically took the information from how that would appear in real life, in a rice plot, and transferred that into a space. And I mean, it's similar in some ways to another series of works called linear paintings, where there's these two-toned paints on drywall. And those come from documents that talk about specific colors or describe the colors in different institutional settings, hospitals, schools, prisons, etc. If one thinks about it, taken off of the walls and then put onto a new wall. And it's a similar thing of, I think, of transporting something of the everyday that surrounds us, again, these structures that surround us, either in the agricultural sphere or in the other case, in an institutional setting, and bring that into this privileged space of an exhibition space where one can have a more contemplative relationship to it. So it's really coming from every day more so than the aesthetic codes of minimalism.
Yeah, and with the linear paintings, it seems to me you must have had this wonderful Eureka moment when you realised that there was this correlation between the height at which paintings are hung in museums and galleries and then the height of where a certain colour had to be painted to in order for hygiene, effectively, versus tuberculosis.
Exactly. Yeah, it was astounding in that way. It was kind of like, so these two worlds have come together. So yeah, there are these happy coincidences sometimes when you think, again, we separate things out, but there are these kind of recurring, patterns, forms, but also ways of being in the world that exist in different quote unquote disciplines, but don't need to be kept so sequestered.
Which contemporary artists do you most admire?
I can't say that because people get angry. My friends will say, but why didn't you say me? I really have no answer to that either. I'm sorry. There's too many. And it's often because I might like someone's a piece, but maybe not their whole oeuvre. And again, as you could probably get the sense, I don't like to pin myself into anything.
I'm getting that feeling. But I have some contemporary artists that I'd like to discuss with you.
Okay.
The Black Audio Film Collective, in an interview with Massimiliano Gioni, you mentioned Black Audio Film Collective, who, in terms of your early development, because you moved from making documentary film into the visual arts. And I imagine that they were an incredibly important conduit between those two spaces. Yeah,
and I was living in Scotland at the time too. I mean, I knew their work beforehand, but when I was really kind of consuming as much as I could, seeing as much as I could of their work, also just the structural organization seemed so interesting, both for them as a collective, but then also what existed in Britain at that time. So the Channel 4 kind of, the television that was there, and the fact that there was television and there was the contemporary art kind of circuit, and also the cinema one just seemed so lovely for me in terms of this flexibility. And of course, working collectively and supporting one another. I mean, filmmaking is collective work, as is exhibition making. But yeah, so those kind of, I think, forms of storytelling and distribution and breadth of reach to different audiences was really inspiring.
Yeah, they absolutely did not say that the art gallery was a more privileged space than television. And it seems to me that sort of level of democracy of message, if you like, even though your language now is utterly different, it seems to be a crucial thing now that you mentioned earlier on. A certain generosity to your audience is crucial in terms of the way that you structure your work.
Yeah, I mean, I was making television before, and that was kind of a very conscious choice at one point until I saw the limits for my particular creative path for those very reasons. And what a wonderful thing to, be watching television and come across this beautifully made visual experience, which would have before been kept only for quote unquote an art audience. And I think, if anything, I think it's more that as you said, generosity or the mobility of these images or shapes or forms or experiences is really, I think, what was arresting for me in terms of the Black Audio Film Collective.
Because you use beads, I'm going to ask you about Felix Gonzalez-Torres, and I wondered to what extent he was in your mind at all in both the work Cloak and in Trinket. He's got that wonderful ability of using a very simple form to tell very complex stories, and it seems to me that's what you're doing too a lot.
Yeah, it's true that if for Cloak, he was more present. Because I kept on saying, do I have permission to do this? Can I do this? Is it going to evoke that too much for other people? And the story that I want to tell won't have its own space. And then, as with the questions I asked myself around minimalism, I said, I'm the common denominator here, and I have to trust that there's so many materials that have already been used. So I gave myself permission to go to the end of my thoughts there. But for the Canada Pavilion, not at all. Not at all. Maybe I had already done my my thought work before.
Yeah, but it is interesting because, again, we're talking about porosity and so on. And it seems to me that it's operating in a really interesting way in connection to the pavilion. I should tell our listeners, even though you're hearing this when the pavilion is open, we're talking a couple of weeks ahead. Is it both an exterior and interior form?
Correct. So going back to this idea of responding to the site, there's a couple wonderful things about the pavilion. One is the fact that the inside and outside do kind of meld. There's a courtyard, there's a tree that grows out of, almost the center of the covered bit of the pavilion, but also is partly in the courtyard and part of the built structure as well. So really immediately that question of porosity between interior and exterior was present. And, the average person won't recognize this, but there's a lot of work done in the architecture to remove some wooden doors and to create glazing so that there was even more visibility, and inside and outside really flowed in and out. And there's a floor that literally has shapes that almost ooze off of the walls onto the floor and then into the courtyard. So there's this almost liquid quality of the forms that allow to think about this intermingling of spaces and times. And so what I had hoped is that people could experience the pavilion from the inside of the courtyard, from the exterior walking by, through the perimeter around it, because there's also an intervention around the whole exterior and within it, so that one is kind of continually moving in and out and wondering where's the core. Of course, there's like a roof on one part, so one might say this is the interior, but really it's more of a sinuous experience, I would hope.
Of course, a lot of what you're saying seems to me to be absolutely in the field of architecture. And I wonder, to what extent do you define what you do in terms of medium? Yeah, I'm talking to you because you're an artist, because you're represented by galleries and you're showing in museums and so on. But you're equally engaging with the field of architecture. And you just literally said, you're removing doors, which is all very architectural problems, right?
Yeah, this has become more and more present in the past 2-3 years, and as I've started to have also kind of more outdoor commissions to work in public space and things like that, and it's a lovely kind of development, I find. Of course, I love working with architects, but it's something that is another world. I mean, it's close, and if we go back into time too, there was, for example, when I studied at the Beaux-Arts de Paris, the architecture school is part of the Beaux-Arts de Paris. I mean, they were of one. So it's something that's becoming more and more of interest to me, is the architecture per se, and who knows, what's going to come next. But I do really respond to the spaces, because there's such craft and creativity and creation of spaces, which when you do installation, you're doing it with different non-permanent, let's say, materials, but you also are thinking in similar ways, I would think.
Absolutely. And of course, architecture historically has so much richness. And I know that, for instance, with your project Pink Blue, you're dealing there with how architecture can overlap with surveillance and control mechanisms and so on. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so Pink Blue it's quite simple. It's just a corridor, and there's paint and there's light. So the first section is a particular hue of pink called Baker Miller pink. And that was used, and is still used actually, in different settings, but particularly in correctional facilities, because there had been some research done that had said that it lowers heart rate, it kind of creates a more calm physical experience. And so those inmates who were, a bit rowdy or difficult to handle would be kind of thrown into this pink room to calm them down. So the first part of this corridor is this Baker Miller pink and white fluorescent lights. The second section of that, it's not necessarily a 50-50 split, but in any case, there's a diagonal line, and then one walks into a space which is painted white, but one doesn't quite know that because they have these blue fluorescent lights which are on the ceiling and kind of bathe the whole space in this blue. And that blue is a light that's found often in public bathrooms, underneath bridges and things like that, to try to dissuade people from using drugs intravenously, because it's meant to make it more difficult to see one's veins. So one has both an interior and exterior, a very carceral, so interior space, as huis clos as one could get, and then more of the public space. But we see in both of the urban space and also the architectural interior spaces the control that can come through simply color and light. And so I think it's probably the most authoritarian project I've done, because one kind of walks through these very physically perturbing spaces, and one feels the question of depth is a bit affected. And if one stays in either of the spaces for too long, one doesn't feel great. Right. And so it was something that was important for me, that speaking about these really hard issues of, control and disciplinary architecture, I didn't want it to be just an intellectual kind of thing where we're citing, of course, this prison that was, we used pink paint. I felt as though we needed to experience what that did to our body, because we're continually around these environments that affect our behavior, affect our comportment, without necessarily paying much attention. These, of course, are extreme ones. But other interiors do similar things.
And I suppose what happens if you are suddenly aware of that as a visitor is that suddenly the world outside could change very quickly. Especially if you're in an urban environment and you're walking under an underpass and you suddenly, that blue is extremely widespread. Anybody who lives in London will know it.
Yep.
So it seems to me that's one of the things that your work does really interestingly is it may have subtle mechanisms, if you like, but it does slightly shift our perspective a bit.
I hope so. I hope that at least makes us just pay a bit more attention. We just kind of recognize the constructs as constructs less as opposed to just accepting them as status quo, I suppose. And that's the first thing, I think, is being able to look at things and then ask questions and decide what one wants to do with that.
A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. The free app offers access to more than 400 cultural organisations through a single download, with new guides being added regularly. As you've heard, Kapwani Kiwanga has been commissioned to make work for the Canada Pavilion at the 2024 Venice Biennale Arte, for which Bloomberg Connects is the official app. Download the app and you'll see that the guide to the Venice Biennale Arte includes an audio guide available in English and Italian, exploring the themes, sections and invited artists in Foreigners Everywhere, the international exhibition at the Biennale, organised by the Brazilian artistic director Adriano Pedrosa. You can also listen to an exclusive interview segment and vocal performance by members of the Mako Collective, read profiles of the two winners of the Golden Lions in this year's exhibition, Anna Maria Maulino and Nil Yalta, explore a full list of the national pavilions and exhibitions around Venice coinciding with the Biennale, the so-called collateral events, and much more. To explore digital guides to all the partnering institutions, download the app today. It's available from the App Store and Google Play, and you can keep up to date by following Bloomberg Connects on Facebook, X formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram. What do you have pinned to your studio wall?
Nothing. I have too much in my head. I need a white wall to project onto, unless there's maybe a list of to-dos. Maybe that's what I have. But where I am right now, there are just windows. And so I have these beautiful pine trees that I look out onto. And there's not much wall space. And so nothing's pinned to the walls, I'm sorry.
No, that's just as interesting an answer as if you've got loads of things pinned to your studio wall. But it's interesting, you talk about windows to the outside. One of the things I'm always interested with artists is, to what extent is your practice a kind of thinking practice where you spend a lot of time just sitting thinking? And to what extent is it much more active, Can a day, a week have very different kind of modes, if you like?
Yeah, I think I have a walking thinking space where it's really being in the city or being in natural environment and just walking and observing and then absorbing this all in. And then, of course, when I'm doing other things, the daily things, cooking, cleaning the house, whatever it might be, things kind of order themselves. And then there's the moments, of course, of sitting in an archive or just sitting down reading a book. And that's also kind of a moment of absorption. And then things kind of filter through and assemble, I think, within the mind and the body. And then there's a point where it's like, it's a really an interesting moment when it has to come out. You're like, okay, I have to do something with all this. Okay, what is it going to be? That can come out really quickly. Like deposing something on a table and be like, okay, there it is. And then one has to kind of slowly sculpt it and refine it based on reality. Like, okay, you can't make something that's 7 feet tall, it has to be 5, etc. I think the research and kind of the thinking and the distilling time is quite long. And then the materialization is almost an electric kind of manifestation and then refined in some ways. So yeah, I think I'm in movement quite a lot.
Which museum or gallery do you visit most frequently?
I'm going to say I can't tell you either. Like I said, I'm walking around, I'm in the world. I don't always have the time to even stop. It's usually when I'm traveling somewhere else where I have the time to see exhibitions, gallery shows, etc. So then there's not one that I go back to over and over again because I'm in a new place. And I think like a lot of people, I end up seeing a lot through a screen, unfortunately.
Right.
So I follow people's work or I kind of fall upon things through what I see online because I can't always get there physically.
I wanted to ask about your project where you worked from the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle, the equivalent of Natural History Museum in Paris, particularly this piece called Subduction Study. These remarkable collages, tell us more about them because it's geological time we're talking about. We talked about the elasticity of time and here we're talking about geological time. Yeah,
that was a lovely experience. I really enjoyed that project. I was really just interested in the relationship between the idea of Africa and the idea of Europe and read a lot about that. There's these interesting engineering projects to bridge the two, etc. And I read a lot. And at one point, I was just like, well, let's go further back, to a point when, of course, there wasn't any separation. There wasn't any clear continents per se. And so I kind of spent a lot of time in this, Pangea kind of moments of history. And going to the Natural History Museum, what is fantastic, because it's a public collection, is that one can take these specimens home. So I selected some rocks from mostly, which would be Spain, and also from what would be Morocco, and photographed those. And then folded them, the photographs once they were printed, to create a new kind of rock formation. So kind of at once, I guess, hinting to this question of a Pangea, but then also thinking forward into a Pangea Ultima, this idea that all of the continents are shifting apart, but will eventually join together again. So this shift between the tectonic plates is very much the inspiration for choosing these rocks from the two different sides of the Strait of Gibraltar, basically. And in that process of researching, I also discovered that, the African plate will subsume the European one little by little. That's when I started to understand these questions of tectonic velocity. So the rates at which continents and tectonic plates are moving. So again, this question of what is perceptible in terms of time, what is perceptible in terms of movement. And we don't perceive that, but we're moving towards each other between what one called the African plate and the European one, actually quite rapidly.
And of course, the great thing about that in terms of content is how it relates to the histories of colonialism and so on, and the idea of a European invasion of Africa and everything that happened. And in relation to Africa moving and heading towards overlapping Europe, it has a lot of resonance, doesn't it?
Yeah. Also just a very simple question of perspective. Like, where are we placing ourselves and how broad is our perspective and scope? Are we looking at our little modern history? Are we looking at big history? And big history is so interesting, right? Yeah. We're not even a grain of sand in this whole thing. And so it puts everything again in perspective. So when I'm interested in what's going on, I'm rarely particularly interested in what's contemporary, debates. Not because I'm not interested in them, but often I see them as part of a longer trajectory. And so I'm always trying to place it in a broader context. And so geological time is one which is quite fruitive in that way.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
Gosh, there's so many. Let's just say going to school, perhaps. Being with other people that you encounter in such a way and you have to create community. Yeah. I grew up in urban bit of southern Ontario where Canada, amongst many countries, is very heavily built on migration from all over the world. So I was, surrounded by people, kids my age, who were from so many different countries. And I didn't realize it, I didn't think until after, how rich and how lucky I was. I remember these things that are very palpable of, we eat different things, but we dress differently, but we don't have the same adult filter. So I think those probably just being in a multicultural environment was probably the biggest cultural experience.
Tell me about your residency in Dakar, because it seems to me in terms of your career, that was a massive moment. Before that, obviously, you had been, as you say, making films and television and so on, and you continued a bit afterwards. But for instance, the works called Flowers for Africa emerged from your experience at Dakar, and that seems to me a really important work in terms of your development.
Yeah, the time in Dakar was great, and it was lovely to be able to go through all of these different archives and, of course, things that were not digitized, and I spent about 2 months just going through different things and not quite knowing how. Most of what you do when you do research, you don't know what you're looking for. But getting really frustrated, being like, I've seen images of African independence before, because that was what I was interested in trying to understand. How is this new? How is this contributing something that is somewhat novel or is going to contribute to perspective? And at one point, the flower arrangements, I spotted them in a photo. I said, well, maybe that could be what it is. And that was kind of the start of that. But I would say that project itself took about a year to really kind of to refine itself as well. Because I did 3 manifestations of Flowers for Africa for Senegal. But because Senegal itself it's more complex. What we know is Senegal now was, when it separated from France, was a federation, and that split apart. So anyways, I'll spare all the historical and political details. But in any case, that was my first manifestation with 3 different bouquets. And the protocol itself, which is now a protocolar work or kind of a text-based work in itself, that gives instructions on how to recreate different floral arrangement that one would see in a historic image. That came little by little. And that's when I started to really kind of think, well, how does one create an immaterial work or piece, which is at the same time material? And those decisions of, not showing the archival image was important. Choosing not to replenish or rejuvenate the flowers and let those be cut flowers that wilt away and at one point kind of almost solidify in as they dry up, was also an important one. So it was a moment when I was able to really trust in the radicality of these artistic gestures. I mean, this is what it is. I hope it's a project that will continue for a few more years, because I've only done 14 countries. We have at least 54. Perhaps there'll be more or less.
Is it right? You do actually really want to do a work for each African country?
Yeah, it'd be lovely. I mean, there's some countries I've been looking for years and I've not been able to find any images because, what has to coincide is that it has to be an historically important moment of either a debate or like a negotiation or a celebration that's linked to independence or the birth of the modern state. And there has to be cut flowers as well. They can't be flowers in a pot, etc. So, yeah, there's some countries that are still elusive. And that's when it's, again, the question of archive and the accessibility is really interesting, because some countries I know I just need to go and probably go through shoeboxes and shoeboxes, and maybe I still won't find anything. And others I've been able to remotely or have friends who are able to go in my place. So yeah, that's, I hope, a project I'll be able to complete in the years to come.
How exciting. Sounds great. Which writers or poets do you return to?
To be honest, literature is present in my life, but I'm much more, when I have time to read, it's nonfiction.
Yeah. I noticed that you studied literature briefly before you moved to anthropology. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. I was accepted for literature, and the offerings for me were a bit too poor in terms of it was kind of similar. I felt experiences that were being written about, and I wanted to kind of have a broader cultural scope, and anthropology was one of the places I could be more independent and search for that. And I used to write as a younger person, so maybe something I'll do a bit more. I mean, when I've done lecture performances, those are a different kind of writing, but it's not something that I have had a lot of time to do in the most recent years. But when I have the headspace and I can really settle to do so, it's enjoyable too. Yeah.
Right. But I would also say that your work has a poetic mode, if you like. There's that wondrous thing about poetry, is that within a few words a whole world can be conjured. And it seems to me that you're doing the same sort of thing with materials. I just didn't know if there was any sense in which you aspire to the condition of poetry to a certain degree, or if that's just a kind of coincidence, in effect.
Yeah, I think there's something that maybe poetry seems so, what it's so lovely about it can be so personal, of course, but one reads in that. And it continues to change when you go back and you read the same words. So maybe there's something in that, but it's nothing that I really considered so much. Because I do think of the poetry as that really free kind of space of really allowing one to open up and to dream and to see in different ways. So I think it would be lovely to think that my work can do that. I hadn't thought of it so much, but yeah.
I wondered if you'd looked, because you've done a lot around power and architecture and surveillance and so on, I wondered, you talked a lot about social sciences and who you're reading in relation to that. Have you looked at Foucault? Is Foucault a kind of useful writer in terms of that space, or is Foucault too sort of established as a sort of power and architecture person? It's almost like you can't rely on that too much because it's so well trodden, as it were.
Yeah, I guess it's probably not cool and cutting edge to think about Foucault now. It's maybe, 40 years too late. Right. But I still do think that, I'm not one for the trends. His thinking was really important for me, especially as a younger person. And I think also because of its breadth in terms of looking at different parts of society and different institutions was really interesting as a framework. And it is of a time, but it still has been useful for me to think about.
What music or other audio do you listen to while you're working?
I love silence. So it's something that's interesting that I love to dance. So when I put on music, it's usually to dance. And otherwise, it's silent, really. A similar thing with like the studio wall, just having a white wall. It's kind of having this quiet to be able to listen to one's inner monologue, maybe, but then also just to the sounds around.
Your very first work, I think the work that you recognise as your first work, was about Sanra. Mm-hmm. Tell me why Sanra. What was important about Sanra in terms of your imaginary and accessing that space? Because he's such an extraordinary figure.
I think what really drew me to him was this question of just, contemporary mythology. So that was the big draw for me. And so then I started to listen to his music. And it took me a while too. I was like, there were some songs that immediately I kind of connected to, and other ones which maybe 6 months later I kind of was able to enter into. I think the power of storytelling and the way that he framed his narrative in such a way that gave so much freedom and breadth to people, especially in redrawing the terms in which he was maybe placed in because of where he was born and all the rest. But the real interest was the myth and the narration, the storytelling. So literature, I guess, is coming back in here somewhere, but the political power of that.
Is there something of an echo of some of your concerns in that work in relation to The Worlds We Tell, which is this study of belief systems and cosmologies, which ends up with these really beautiful relief sculptures and relief paintings and so on? Tell us more about that, because it's such an intriguing project.
Yeah, The Worlds We Tell, I think there's something maybe closer to architecture in some way, and wondering, how is it that we shape our world based on the stories that we tell? So these creation myths, and how we then order our worlds by incorporating these stories that literally make you see the world in a certain way. The invisibles, which would be an underworld or the world of the spirits or whatever that might be. But that one can often, have you been told stories, you can formalize that. One has a shape, has an image in their mind. And that influences how we make our homes, how we make our cities, how we also maybe sit around a dinner table or don't sit around a dinner table. So all of these questions of, organization and just shapes, forms, coming from language was really interesting. And so again, the question of material comes into this body of work too, because in most creation myths, there's of course different materials that come about. So there could be a certain water or a certain tree or whatever else. And through reading these different cosmogonies from different parts of the world, I kind of honed in on different materials, and I use those in my own reinterpretation of what the forms and shapes evoked for me based on those cosmogonies.
At this point, I ask which other media influence your work. I suspect I may be getting a certain answer, so I'm going to answer it for you. I'm really interested here about film, and in particular, the fact that you came to Europe originally because you were interested in experimental film, and I'm just interested in that. Which experimental film drew you here?
So there was documentary filmmaking that I found just really, really, really strong. And I think also, I grew up in Canada. The National Film Board of Canada, some amazing documentaries, animations, all that, which I took for granted because I grew up with it. But there was something, about some of the films I was seeing coming out of Europe that I really found interesting. And so that's why I kind of came saying, well, I'd like to work in moving image. And I didn't feel like North America was going to be the place where I'd be able to really have the slow time that I wanted, the long shots. It felt like I'd have more space in Europe to do that. And I just happened to kind of end up settling in Great Britain. But there's something that's true when we say about film, and I think it's still present in my work in this way of thinking about, I want choreography in this space of the body moving through. But then one thinks about, how that kind of assembles in a collage of time and space and rhythm that I think also comes from editing film. And so if we think of oneself as, walking through the spaces, almost editing these different moments and perspectives into a sequence that is then reshuffled, and of course it's not one that you can play back and look at, but is somewhat registered in one's body. There's something I think in that I just started thinking about that more consciously in the past year or so, that I think really is also influenced by that experience of filmmaking. That's
interesting. There's also a lot of framing, it seems to me, in the work. There's lots of frames, and I don't just mean literal frames as in something like Jalousie, which is a work which is on a kind of screen structure, but other works. I can see lots of frames, lots of things set within other settings and so on, and that seems to me to be quite cinematic.
But again, these frames are always moving, right?
Yeah.
So they could be like, the zooming in, the zooming out, and the fading away, and, the fade in, the fade out. So all of these frames are very, like we said before, porous or elastic. So there is this perspective that's continually changing, and you're very right. In Jalousie, it's very evident because it's using two-way mirror, or sometimes people say one-way mirror. So when first approaches it, one sees a reflection of themselves and the environment. And as they circumnavigate and they get to the other side of the structure, they can see through and they can see other people. And then one is in kind of like caught or drawn into this question of surveillance, which is, again, the total mobility of relationships of power and of visibility.
Is there a particular discipline in your daily working life that you see as an essential ritual?
No, it's always changing. It's always adapting to what I need at that time and where I am. And there's so many different parts of the process, right? There's as I said, there's kind of this absorption stage when one's bringing in ideas and observing, and there's a moment of then communicating that to others and to form. So there's different things that are needed at different times. So there's not something that is continuous.
You mentioned about walking. I was also wondering about drawing, because I don't think I've seen any drawings. And I was wondering about drawing and making maquettes and things like that. What's your kind of sketch form, if you like?
Oh, my sketches are horrid. And they're so illegible. So I have someone who helps translate it into, more architectural language at times. But it's interesting because with this particular person, they understand my sketches. So they really are like notes, but the perspective, scale, proportions are pretty much all over the place. So they really are just notes to self almost. And then I'm able to talk through and explain the squiggle.
I'm dreading what you're going to say into this one. You ready?
Okay.
If you could live with just one work of art, what would it be?
So, of course, I'm not going to answer within the frame of art history or something, but I think it would just be the light and shade, seeing light that falls on whatever it is. And it's always changing, right? And it's always available. And it's a question of just attention, just stopping and paying attention to something. So I think that's something that is always there. There's something that is just so simple, but also so powerful about, how light interacts with shade. That's it.
And lastly, what's art for?
The soul. I think the art's for the soul in whatever way that is. Maybe shaking it up, maybe, a balm. But I think it connects with our deepest thing that I don't know we can call it apart from soul. And so for me, it is that. And even if, people have many different ways and they want to use it, and it might be for different ends of explaining, of witnessing, of challenging. But in any case, it only works if it's resonating with our soul in some way. So for me, that's what art is. It's to remind us that we have one and to connect with that.
Kapwani, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kapwani Kiwanga, Trinket, is at the Canada Pavilion in the 60th Venice Biennale in Italy from the 20th of April to the 24th of November. Kapwani Kiwanga, The Length of the Horizon, is at Copenhagen Contemporary in Denmark until the 25th of August. And that's it for this episode, and indeed for this series. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Do also subscribe to our sister podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues every week. And please subscribe to the Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com. We're on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Tan Audio, and on Facebook, Instagram and Threads. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producer is Lewis Jebb. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway. A big thank you to Kapwani Kiwanga. We're back at the end of May. Bye for now. A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.